I'm Jeremy. For over 2,000 years, many historians have argued about whether or not Jesus Christ resurrected from the dead. Jews especially believe that Christ did not rise from the dead. However, I'm here today to claim that Jesus Christ resurrected from the dead. I will first show that historical accounts of Jesus Christ's death and resurrection do exist. Secondly, I will show that Jesus Christ did in fact disappear from his tomb. And finally, I will confirm his resurrection through eyewitness accounts of his post-mortem appearances. First of all, many historians of past and present both agree that Jesus Christ suffered death by crucifixion and rose from the dead 3 days later. Cornelius Tacitus, a non-Christian historian of the 1st century, writes about Jesus in his annals, saying that Christus, in other words Christ, was executed by the hands of the procurator Pontius Pilate. And another historian of the 1st century, Flavius Josephus, also writes about Jesus in his historic work Antiquities of the Jews, in which he states, "And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst them, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the 3rd day." In addition to these 1st century historians, many historians of modern day also agree that the historical events of Christ's death and resurrection to be filled with truth. Professor Thomas Arnold, author of the famous History of Rome and chair of modern history at Oxford, states, I know to know one fact in history of mankind which is proved by better and fuller evidence of every sort to the understanding of a fair inquirer than the great sign which God hath given us. Christ died and rose again from the dead. Similarly, E.M. Blaylock, professor of classics at Auckland University, says, "I tell you that the evidence for the life and death and the resurrection of Christ is better authenticated than most of the facts of ancient history." Not only do both of these historians confirm that Christ was real, but they also confirm that the fact that Jesus Christ resurrected. Moving on to my second point, I will now prove that Christ's burial tomb was empty within 3 days of his crucifixion. Joseph of Arimathea, a man of the Roman court responsible for sentencing Christ to death, was in charge of giving Christ a proper burial. Usually criminals sentenced to death did not receive a burial, but Joseph decided to give Christ a burial, including wrapping him in linens and cloth and laying him in a tomb that was sealed by a boulder. This boulder, through the Roman tradition, can be estimated to be the size of 2 tons. Christ's tomb was also guarded by Roman guards so that the Christ's tomb was not tampered with. The punishment of tampering with Christ's tomb was death. However, on the 3rd day, when a group of women went to see Christ's tomb, the boulder had been moved. The guards were gone, and so was Christ's body. As recorded in the Bible, Mark 16, verses 2 through 4, very early on the 1st day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance to the tomb?" But then they looked up, and they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. The only thing that remained in the tomb was the cloth and linen that Christ had been buried in, still in the shape and position of his body. The immensity of the rock would have made it impossible for anyone, let alone a group of women, to remove rock without disturbing the guards. If the women did not move the rock, then who did? What had moved the rock was nothing short of a miracle, and you can tell that it was truly miraculous because the guards left their post after this incident occurred. A guard would be killed if he left his post for duty without reason under the Roman law. Therefore, we know something spectacular happened. The guards reported back to the Jewish leaders in shock of the missing body, and the Jewish leaders paid the guards to lie about what happened to the body by saying that the disciples stole the body. We know that it would have been impossible for the disciples to steal the body for 2 reasons. One being that the disciples were cowards. In the Bible, it tells how one of the disciples, Peter, so feared punishment that he denied Christ 3 times in order to save his own life. And 2, it would be humanly impossible to move a boulder weighing 2 tons without disturbing the guards. All in all, it is proven that Jesus Christ's tomb was empty 3 days after his death, and this disappearance was a miracle, not a robbery. Now for my third and final point, I will show you that Jesus Christ appeared to others after his death. After Christ rose from the dead, he appeared to over 500 different people, some individually and others in large groups. One of the men who saw Jesus after he rose from the dead was Saul, also known as Paul. Paul was a Jewish Pharisee who sought to prosecute and murder Christians because he did not believe Jesus Christ was the Son of God. However, as documented in the Bible, Acts 9, verses 3 through 8, Christ appeared to Paul as he was headed to prosecute Christians. This event left Paul blind for 3 days, and after the 3 days, Paul was a changed man. The experience led him to be a follower of Christ. Although Christ has also appeared to his own followers, this example shows that he too appeared to his prosecutors. By appearing to his prosecutors, it is clear that these stories were not made up. Why would a man filled with hatred for Christ all of a sudden worship him despite the fact that he was dead? Edwin M. Tamucci, Associate Professor of History in Miami University, says, what gives a special authority to this list of witnesses as historical evidence is that the reference to most of the 500 brethren being still alive. St. Paul says in effect, if you do not believe me, you can ask them. Such a statement is an admittedly genuine letter written within 30 years of the event is almost as strong evidence as one could hope to get for something that happened nearly 2,000 years ago. It is clear that Paul and the other 500 witnesses were legitimate witnesses to what was the side of Christ resurrected. In conclusion, through the historical proof, the disappearance of Christ's body, and the multiple eyewitness accounts of Christ's post-mortem appearances, it is clear that Jesus Christ resurrected from the dead.
Kloss. C-L-O-S-S. All right, Jeremy, the organizational structure is very good. You set up your proposition clearly. We know where you're going. The preview is all fine. You signpost the points as you go along. The proof on the first point really is the idea of using the historians, I think, is helpful, and you try to use a combination of historians from the first century and from more modern times. The data on which the historians are basing their conclusions probably needs a little bit more explanation, but I do think that you're doing the right thing here, trying to show that this is part of an historical record, that these are not theological proofs that are being offered here, but historical proofs, and you try and find some ways to make that evidence seem more independent. I thought that that was the right way to go about that. I'm not exactly sure that the self-referential statements, though, for instance, of the professor of classics, that extol the quality of their own evidence is as convincing as it could be. The phrasing on it is very eloquent, but I'm not sure how accurate they are in assessing it on themselves. On the second point, you are much more dependent upon scriptural records to support the positions that you're taking, and it would be, if you're going to do that and you want to treat the Bible as historically valid as information, then I think you need to back that up a little bit. And I know it's complicated to do because you've got a lot of the material you're trying to present and you only have a limited amount of time. Of course, you did pick a pretty damn big issue, So I'm sorry, Dan. Well, I didn't say that. I didn't defame anybody. I didn't say. Okay. I don't want to get in trouble. And the whole experience of Paul, for instance, again, that sounds like a reference from the Bible. Now, I think that there are some other independent sources that you could add to this. And one of the things that you might do to gain some more credibility is compare those historical records to traditional histories in other places. That's a very standard way by which this argument is being made. One of the problems is that there are lots of situations where we have to rely on questions to create a justification for a conclusion. Why would anybody do this? How could such a thing have happened? That sort of thing. And that invites all kinds of speculation, because if you give an answer to the question that is reasonable and rational and fits the criteria, and then you don't have, you're kind of relying on this sort of disjunctive argument. It's got to be either X or Y, and I'm saying it's not Y, therefore it has to be X. Well, if they can show that it is in fact why, then your assumption that it has to be the other explanation is a little bit problematic. We're going to be talking about reasoning when we get done with the test next week, and so that'll be a big part of the explanation. Whoever's responding to this one, pay close attention on the reasoning processes when we talk about them, because that would be one of the places that I think you'd want to go here. All right, thank you. Chuck.